Welcome to ILTV's Insider. I'm Devo Klein. In just 62 days, Israelis will head to the polls, and this election could mark one of the most consequential political moments in the country's recent history. To help us break all of this down, we've brought together two very different perspectives on Israeli politics. Don Perry is a veteran journalist and former senior editor with the Associated Press, who has covered Israel, the Middle East, and international affairs for decades. And Ruthie Blum is a senior editor at JNS and a veteran commentator on Israeli politics, security, and international affairs. Let's start with the big question. After nearly 2 decades of Netanyahu's cumulative time in power, why do you think this election could actually be different?
Oh, I think it'll be different largely because of the polls. In fact, Israel has essentially a two-block system, not a two-party system, but two blocks. And on the night of elections, you can pretty much know which block has won because they've been well-defined since 1977. And that is the Likud, the right, the far right, and the Haredi parties and the religious parties, one block, the right-wing block, versus the left, the so-called center, the liberal side of Israel, plus the Arab parties. And pretty much every Israeli election has been determined, in effect, by those two blocks. Very rarely is there confusion. Sometimes the winning bloc doesn't rule as a bloc. They are so uncomfortable with their own radical fringe that they prefer to reach across the aisle, and then you have Likud Labor governments and things like that. But you really kind of know who's going to be prime minister. Now, historically, the polls in Israel have been freakishly close. It's always 60-60 or somewhere close to that. The last election, in fact, by a pure count of the vote, was pretty much a 50-50 vote. It would have resulted in 60-60 or 61-59. Much of the left-wing vote was lost because of small splinter parties that didn't make the threshold of 3.25%. So the current polls show Netanyahu at 50 seats or less, and the opposition at 70 seats or more. So to be a little bit vulgar in answering your question, it's because of the polls, but also because I know the polls reflect something real. Netanyahu has failed too much. And in particular, his efforts to, in my view, Putinize the country and create an elected autocracy. Many will defend that. Ruthie will defend it. The truth is, they wanted to run a Russia, Hungary, Turkey-style system. That was unpopular because most people in Israel don't want the government to be able to, bulldoze their home just because it was elected 3 years ago. And the second thing is the failure of October 7th, and I know we're going to get into that later, was too stupendous. You can't survive that in public opinion. And so, the polls reflect what I know to be true. He was in very big trouble, in particular, because on top of all that, his alliance with the Haredi parties caused him too much. They pushed the envelope too far. And by insisting that in the middle of a catastrophic war, he actually promote legislation that would exempt, not many of them, pretty much all of them, from military service, it makes people here crazy. And remember, just people should know, the Haredim are currently a sixth of the country. With 7 kids apiece, they double as a proportion every 20 years. You're looking at a majority in 40 years that doesn't work half the time, that doesn't teach its children math, English, and science, and now refuses to participate in the defense of Israel. This type of catastrophe that this government is presiding over is meant to lead to electoral defeat. Put all that together, and yes, I do expect it.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that Dan mentioned that the last election there were, on the left, splinter parties that were responsible for their defeat, for the left's defeat, the left-wing bloc, you could say. This time around, it looks as though the right wing is going to shoot itself in the foot with splinter parties. Practically every day, another spin-off either of Netanyahu's Likud party or other right-wingers who were not in politics before. There are about, if I'm not mistaken, Dan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, about 8 new parties that are on the right or center-right or whatever. And if they don't pass the threshold, their votes from the right will go into the garbage, and that threatens Netanyahu's, getting reelected, okay? Now, I didn't agree with what Dan said about Netanyahu's failures because, yes, there is a lot of internal strife here, there always has been, but after October 7th, it is true that October 7th was the worst catastrophe ever. But the question is, what happened since October 7th? And I happen to consider that Israel's situation, its security situation, is much, much better than it was on October 6th for many reasons, and that is the multi-front war that is not over. But if you had told any Israeli 3 years ago that Israeli pilots would be able to fly over Iran back and forth sorties, nobody would have believed you. That's just one example. Now, what I would like to add to that is, again, the polls are problematic because there are very, very different polls on different TV channels and newspapers. So we'll see. We don't really know. What we do know, and Dan is right, the polls can be sort of accurate. It's a little too early to trust them because we have 2 more months before the election. A little more, 2 more months. And we'll have to see closer to the time. But I think that Netanyahu is still popular in the bloc, in the sense that what many Israelis will tell you is there's nobody who could have managed this war and the international community as smoothly as he did with all the difficulties.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Ruthie, I would actually strongly agree with your comment there earlier with many right-wing parties. They're popping up like popcorn. Like you say, a lot of breakaways from the Likud, which also could potentially be blamed on Netanyahu. But I want to go back to Dan and ask a further question. It's obvious that October 7th will be in people's minds when they head to the polls. It will be weighing on this current election cycle. But my question to you is just how much can you be judging Netanyahu and the broader political leadership for the security failures that preceded it?
Totally. And I'll explain why. But before I do, please let me answer a few of Ruthie's points. There are no credible polls that show anything other than what I described, and I think you know. The polls that are different are comically different. They're on Channel 14, which is a pure propaganda channel, lock, stock, and barrel. They mean nothing. But polls could change depending on, if the Iranian regime falls. The second thing is Israel's standing being better than it was is something I cannot conceivably agree with. Of course, they've had some tactical successes, and the army has achieved amazing things, and Israeli intelligence in particular, what they were able to display in the first days of the latest Iran war. I mean, it's quite amazing. All of that is true, but Israel's complete failure to convert that into strategic gains is bone crushing. And a majority of Israel's population, I do believe, suspects, and I think suspects correctly, that Netanyahu prolonged the wars, sacrificed the lives of hostages and soldiers because it was politically opportune for him to do so. It's a terrible thing to be accused of. I'm sorry, it's a terrible thing to potentially have had happen. And whoever considers that to be outrageous cynicism isn't paying attention. Now, to your question about October 7th, sometimes it would have been unfair. Like, September 11th in America, it kind of came out of nowhere. You could say that there were signs and there were some intelligence failures, and they could have done better to prevent it, but realistically, it was a thunderbolt. Whereas in Israel, it was a result of a horribly misguided gamble presided over by Netanyahu, who preferred to have Hamas be in charge in Gaza because he felt that weakened the Palestinians and created a divided leadership. His tactic all along had been to, while pretending otherwise, weaken the Palestinian Authority, demonize the Palestinian Authority. And by the way, before anyone jumps in, they helped him by doing a lot of stupid things, but they're still the least bad option that we actually have. And Netanyahu, in his effort to forestall, basically forever, negotiations on a separation agreement with the Palestinians, which Israel needs, because without that, and the viewers should know, this is not about who's tough and who's not tough and naive. This is about, do you want a binational state that's 50% Arabs? And that is not the Zionist dream, independent of whether you're oppressing or not oppressing the Palestinians. So Netanyahu actually does, weirdly, because he thinks Israel can forever rule them and it will still somehow be a Jewish state. In aid of that, he was happy to have Hamas rule Gaza, because Hamas discredits the Palestinians by being so vile. Now, that was a gamble that backfired spectacularly, on top of which, on October 7th, the military left Gaza almost completely unguarded. That's why they were able to cut through the fence like butter. Why was that the case? Well, not only credulousness about Hamas, but also because much of the army was moved to the West Bank. because Netanyahu's right-wing fascistic allies were preparing, because of the Jewish holiday, to create mayhem with the Palestinians. A total, complete screw up at a level that is epic, historic. I've rarely seen such a thing. And so, yes, if you add to that, that the heads of the Shin Bet, the military, and the Mossad were begging to meet Netanyahu during July, August, and September, and he refused to meet with them, knowing that they would tell him that the Putinization effort that you're doing in Israel, good or bad, is creating such dissonance in the country that it invites attack. He didn't want to hear that. And so he refused to meet with the security chiefs. Clearly, he's implicated up to the gills, which is why the wars went on so long. The whole time Netanyahu is saying we can't investigate it because it would be premature during a war. And he dragged it on for 2 or 3 years. Now, look, you can fool some of the people some of the time. You can fool many of the people much of the time. If Netanyahu loses this election, it's because he failed to fool enough people enough of the time.
And Ruthie, I know that you're dying to respond to quite a few of those comments. I'll let you go ahead.
There are too many to respond to, but what I would say is, of course, Netanyahu was prime minister on October 7th, and therefore it happened on his watch. I totally agree with that. However, the years leading up to that, I think that Dan is distorting the whole picture, because the years leading up to that, and this is the reason we need, among other reasons, judicial reform, is that Israel's hands were tied many times over and continue to be tied by the Supreme Court and the Attorney General. If I have any criticism of Netanyahu, and I think this explains some of the splinter right parties, is that he wasn't forceful enough. For example, when he fired the Attorney General, and then the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that, and then she's still there. Those are the disappointment that many of us on the right feel, that he didn't go up against them forcefully enough. And during the judicial reform protests, he caved, and so really nothing happened in the way that we had hoped. But again, and where let's say a commission of inquiry is concerned, it's not that Netanyahu doesn't want one. It's that he wants one that is made up with various sectors of society, hostages, hostage families. Yes. And
I have to respond.
Okay, you can argue. You don't agree with that. I don't agree with anything. You said we know that, okay? And especially not about the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian state, and a majority of Israelis totally oppose Palestinian statehood because they know it will be a terrorist state, which it would be.
Dan?
All right, so yeah, let me try to reply. I think you'd need to stretch reality beyond a breaking point to suggest the Supreme Court prevented Netanyahu from not promoting Hamas and letting them roll in Gaza, okay? Nor from attacking Hamas. What we're talking about is that the Supreme Court in Israel is the only thing that prevents the 60-some-year occupation, 60-year occupation of West Bank from degenerating into a total disgrace. So yes, they try to impose some guardrails on the military's ability to oppress the Palestinians. That's not a terrible idea, because it might prevent the third intifada. I only wish they did it more. And I can tell you, as someone who petitioned the Supreme Court on many occasions, as the AP regional chief and as the Foreign Press Association chairman in Israel, to get them to allow us to do things as media that the military didn't want, we never once won. The Supreme Court seemed to us to be a rubber stamp supporting the government and the military. So this idea that there's some kind of liberal bastion preventing a conservative government from defeating the Palestinians is patently and almost preposterously false. But honestly, the idea that Israel emerges strong from what has happened here is just so, Ruthie, forgive me, it's so laughable. Israel has gone from a situation where it had majority support in the U.S. to a situation where, and we know from multiple polls, 60% of Americans and the overwhelming majority of American youth have had it with Israel and support the Palestinians over Israel. All right, Israel's leaders are wanted at The Hague. Never mind that I think that's nonsense. Israel, if not for the U.S. veto at the Security Council, which may not be around for long once Trump is gone, would be facing international sanctions Israelis might not be able to travel anywhere if they were ever in the army because of what happened in Gaza. And consider that these wars were dragged on for as long as they were, and Hamas is still in charge in Gaza, as I predicted they would be, and Hezbollah still bedevils Lebanon, and the war in Iran was a strategic fiasco because Israel and the U.S. failed to plan for the obvious, inevitable, totally foreseeable blocking of the Strait of Hormuz, and then Trump panicked. All of this is such a strategic cul-de-sac, so totally misguided, such a new chapter in the March of Folly that to say Israel's better off, I mean, honestly, I understand that one has to make an argument, but really, I mean, I think at the very least we should take some pity on the people of Israel that have been suffering 3 years of war and economic deprivation. Every part of Israel has contributed to these troops that are spending 200 days of reserve duty a year to prosecute these wars that have in fact led nowhere. And we're all very proud of the planes flying over Iran and some terrorists killed, but clearly it led nowhere. While Netanyahu, time after time, rejected off ramps that could have led to something better and maybe cost less and not left Israel's international standing totally trashed. And one more thing, this idea of the investigative commission, which should have happened obviously years ago, being delayed because Netanyahu wants all sectors to be represented. What on earth are we talking about here? The idea, in every crisis, every failure that was of sufficient stature in the history of Israel was followed by a national, apolitical investigative commission led by a Supreme Court judge, and it can be a right-wing judge. Okay, we know who the conservative judges are, and by the way, there's a conservative majority on the Supreme Court right now. Netanyahu is trying to create a political commission where half the commission would be opposition and half would be coalition, and it would basically be completely discredited from the get-go by the very fact that it was defined by politics. And what's their only argument? That judges, even conservative judges, can't be trusted to not be against the right wing. It's pitiful. Ruthie and Devo, it's pitiful. If Netanyahu loses the election, as I assess and obviously hope he will, it will be because he insulted the intelligence of the people too much.
Time flies when you're having fun, and this was an incredibly informative debate. And I want to say thank you to both of our guests for joining us today. Ruthie, I'm so sorry, but we do have to wrap up. A big thank you to Dan and Ruthie for joining us today for this discussion. Be sure to subscribe to ILTV so you don't miss an episode, and catch us live 24/7 on Screen IL. I'm Devo Klein. Thank you all so much for watching ILTV's Insider.